invite Senator McAllister to begin.
Thanks very much, Chair. Minister, I have quite a number of questions around the escaping violence payments, so I will try and get through them as quickly as I can, and any assistance you can provide I would appreciate.
Short answers.
Yes, how long will a woman have to wait after making an application to receive the payment?
Okay, could I perhaps ask if the either Ms Heffron-Webb or Mr Bennett might be able to answer some of these more detailed questions just to make sure we're absolutely correct?
I'll pass over to Mr Bennett.
Good afternoon, Senator. So it will depend on the situation associated with when they contact Uniting Care in circumstances where they need immediate assistance. Uniting Care has the ability to provide up to $500. Part of the process with the escaping violence payment is that the period of time that the support is available is up to 12 weeks, and the way that the payment has been set up is that Uniting Care will work with the recipient associated with what their needs are, taking into account the potential to provide support over a 12-week period. So why I say that is that depending on what the circumstances are associated with the need, it's difficult to say immediately when someone might receive something, but if they are in urgent need, then Uniting Care has the ability to provide up to $500.
Right, and are there any goals in terms of responsiveness to applications embedded within the service contracts?
So the service arrangement, as I said, if there is an immediate need, someone will be supported, depending on the nature of the inquiry, taking into account that Uniting Care will need to triage. It'll be somewhere between immediate up to 2 days.
Yes, the reason I ask is because I've had a disturbing case brought to me, and I'm conscious that we're in the early stage of the program, but on Saturday, 4 days after the program opened, a woman in Western Australia applied for a payment, and I'm withholding her identifying details at her request. But she didn't hear anything from the service provider until Tuesday, and they allegedly told her that they were inundated, and so they couldn't tell her when an emergency payment would be approved. I'm concerned that the arrangements don't appear to be adequately resourced to deliver against that service standard.
Senator McAllister, what you've just said is quite concerning to me, and I understand why you're not going to publicly name the person who's contacted you, but I would be particularly keen to work with you to actually deal with the detail of what you've just put forward to see, to get to the bottom of it, because this is a trial, and one of the most important things in trial and the evaluation is to get to understand what the issues are, to make sure that this program is meeting and supporting the needs of victim survivors. So whilst I obviously understand that you're not going to discuss it here, I would be very keen to discuss it with you to make sure that this person that you're referring to, the issues that you're raising are resolved as quickly as possible, not just for her but for anyone else.
So the payment is structured, thank you Minister, the payment is structured to be paid out over as many as 12 weeks by the evidence provided by Mr Bennett. Your media release, Minister, said that the payments will assist people who need financial support to leave. That crisis point, that emergency point, is important, isn't it? Having support at that moment of departure when, as you say, a person may put themselves, their children, maybe their dog into the car. I think they were the words you've used publicly. That is the moment in time. It's not the only moment in time, but it is a moment in time when resources are desperately needed, is it not?
Yeah, look, absolutely, Senator McAllister. And I think, one of the things that we were seeking to do by this program was to make sure that it was another tool that was available to women, because one of the feedback was that additional money for putting a bond down on a place to stay. Obviously, all of the other services that are provided and the wraparound services and those immediate crisis point services that are provided by those fantastic frontline service providers that we have around the country, still remain in place. But clearly, it is that, I suppose, as you would know, sometimes not being able to have that money once you've gone through that immediate crisis point of actually you've left, to be able to have the money to be able to set up a safe place for you to stay is often the reason that women go back or maybe don't leave in the first place. And so we were trying to fill in a gap that was perhaps the reason why women were returning to violent relationships.
Okay, but so the expectation is based on the advice from Mr Bennett that in most circumstances an application will be resolved one way or the other within 2 days.
Senator, I come back to the point associated with triage where I don't want to say in most circumstances, because depending on how people present themselves, they can get immediate support. So I'm just reflecting that you have situations where people who need the support will immediately get it. Depending on their circumstances, it could be associated with that triaging process up to 2 days.
Sorry, I think that's made it less clear for me, Mr Bennett. You're expecting that every applicant will be assessed under a triaging process within 2 days so that all people who are in an emergency situation will receive a payment within 2 days. Is that what you're saying?
Senator, I might try and add. So as Minister Ruston said, it might be that someone applies and they apply for the funding because they've left and they've gone to a shelter, for example, but they wish to rent a property, they need the money for a bond, they're not applying for the emergency $500. So in that case, I think what Mr Bennett was trying to say, that group, it's not necessarily a 2-day turnaround, but for people who are applying for that immediate cash of $500, there's a 2-day
I see.
sort of KPI around.
And will they self-identify, or is that a process determining which category they fall into, whether they are to be determined within 2 days or whether they may be left for a longer period, is that something that the provider will do or that the applicant will do?
Well, obviously the applicant will come forward with their situation and the provider will ask them what do they need. Do they need something immediately? Are they looking for longer term support? So that would be determined in a conversation between the applicant and the provider.
So to meet this goal, all applicants are going to need to have such a conversation within 2 days?
Yes, it would need to be obvious to the provider who needs to be supported in that way, correct?
Right, so some kind of assessment needs to be undertaken by the provider within 2 days of an application, in all cases, so as to ensure that people who require emergency support may be assisted within that time frame. Is that a fair statement of the requirement?
Yes.
Okay, and that's built into the service delivery contract with Uniting Care?
Without having the exact clause in front of me, that is my recollection.
Okay. I'm interested in understanding how you came to the figure of $5,000 for the payment. Was there any analysis undertaken about the average expenses incurred by a person leaving violence?
My understanding was that at the advice of of a number of people in the sector, that this additional support was the kind of quantum and the decision around the breakup between the $1,500 in cash as opposed to the $3,500 in kind was to make sure that the woman, in most instances, who is getting this, the payments could be made directly on her behalf. So there wasn't another course of action of potential financial abuse through this process. But Senator, the reason we've set it up as a trial is obviously we want to assess this and work out whether this really is meeting the needs, whether the way it is, has been designed, and we'll be working through an evaluation process that will run concurrently with the trial, so that we can make any changes as we see as we go forward.
Can I ask about the cash component? Your media release minister says women will receive financial assistance of up to $1,500 cash. The application page from the service provider says up to $1,500 in financial assistance, such as vouchers. Is it cash or vouchers or both? How does that component work?
Senator, it'll depend on the circumstances. So it'll be a mixture between vouchers, it can be cash, it can be an electronic funds transfer, so it'll depend on the circumstances. Financial assistance was used in the broad because I think a better expression is cash equivalent.
Okay, so a cash equivalent of up to $1,500. What is the balance of the $5,000 allowance imagined to be available for?
In terms of the other aspects, it would be if they needed to, for example, have support with bonds or school fees. It's still financial support. It would be a case, though, for example, if it was a bond that Uniting Care would make arrangements to pay for the bond, etc., rather than paying the person who pays for the bond.
But Sen McAllister, just to be clear, there is no defined list as to what the particular person could use the $3,500. That's why we've got Uniting Care. They would work with the person to determine what were going to be the things that they believed were going to be able to provide them with the best pathway to establish a new safe place for them and, in many instances, for their children. So what the things that we are using as examples are just that, they're examples, and we will rely very heavily on Uniting Care's extraordinary experience in this particular field to determine what is, and work with the client or the person who's escaping violence to work with them about what their needs are.
That is an interesting explanation. I'm a little confused as to why the program is described as having a cap of $1,500 on financial assistance. How is that distinguished from the broader $5,000 allowance?
I'm sorry, without knowing exactly the reference to financial assistance.
That was the term you... let me step you through it.
Yeah.
The media release says women will receive financial assistance of up to $1,500 in cash.
Yes.
The service provider says women will receive up to $1,500 in financial assistance, such as vouchers. So we have a tension between the minister's position, which says cash, and the web page, which says vouchers. The minister, I think, has explained that it's going to be able to be either up to $1,500 in cash or vouchers.
Cash or cash equivalent.
Cash or cash equivalent. Why only $1,500? Why not the full $5,000? What was the rationale for putting that $1,500 cap within the allowance?
I think I just answered that a minute ago. One of the things that we often see that we wanted to make sure that we avoided was that financial abuse. We didn't want financial abuse. In some instances, we don't. Women, when they really are in a very dangerous situation, we don't even want them to use their bank accounts because we don't, in case they are actually tracked and traced as to where they are. So the cash component or the cash equivalent component was about being able to, go down and be able to, maybe buy the kids the school lunch boxes or new toothbrushes or that really sort of upfront stuff. The $3,500 up to $3,500, where Uniting Care on behalf of the individual will actually pay the amount. It's about firstly not allowing an opportunity where the abusive partner could actually continue the financial abuse to try and get their hands on that money. Clearly builds a removal of the traceability of the expenditure because, of course, if we're putting money into the person's account, then there is a possibility that they could be traced by it. So there are a number of reasons why that division was put in place. But as I said, we certainly will be monitoring the whole way through to make sure that we've got the settings right.
Does the service provider have discretion to spend as much as $5,000 on every applicant, or are there some constraints that you've placed on the service provider in terms of how much of that allocation they might utilise for each person?
We've placed no constraints on service provider.
Great. Can the funding be used to cross-subsidise a service that would otherwise be provided?
Senator, could you just expand that for me?
Okay, so on the Uniting Care application website, they say you could be eligible for up to $1,500 in financial assistance, such as vouchers, goods and services such as removalist bonds and basics for a new home, and their third dot point is wraparound support, including casework from the EVP provider. Is the casework to be funded from within the $5,000 allocation?
The way that the system was working was that, taking into account the people would need support, as I said, during a 12-week period, there would be links to other services, etc. The question that you've asked is, are those other services deducted from the $5,000? No, it's a referral. It's a connection to rather than a deduction from.
And Senator McAllister, it's also worth pointing out that it's not taxable, it's not reportable.
Yes, right, understood. Are there any directives to service providers to use vouchers where possible? Have you provided any guidance about a preference for cash or for vouchers?
No.
No. Is there any circumstance where something like a cashless debit card would be given to an applicant?
No.
No.
And can you guarantee that the government will not be attempting to put domestic violence victims onto a cashless debit card?
Yes.
If a person who is on the cashless debit card were to apply, would they be treated any differently to another applicant?
No.
No, so they would be eligible to receive a cash payment. The media release described this as a one-off payment. The service provider's website says that the payment is available to anyone who hasn't accessed it in the previous 12 months. Which is it? Would it be available more than once for an applicant?
It's available once a year.
Right.
So and at this stage it's a 2-year pilot, so potentially people will qualify twice.
But Senator McAllister, clearly we're hoping that that's not the case.
Of course. No, I understand that. I'm trying to understand the parameters of the program. Are there any circumstances where the program, where the provider might seek to recover a payment from an applicant?
I'm not aware of any such circumstances.
No.
Unless there was some
unless there was a
evidence of
fraudulent
Yeah.
kind of situation. But
somebody who clearly wasn't, they just lied.
if someone, subsequently, changes their plan about what they're going to do, no, there'll be no recovery of the payment.
Yeah, right. I understand. Thank you. That is, in fact, the answer to my question. And are men eligible for this payment?
Yes.
Right. Thank you.
If it's been answered. Sorry, was it answered?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So any person may apply?
Correct.
Yes. But as you'd understand, Senator McAllister, the overwhelming number of people in this situation are women.
I do understand. We have talked about the program being demand-driven previously. You'll confirm that, Minister. And you've budgeted around $73 million this year and the following year. You assess, I think, that you're going to be able to assist 12,000 women a year, roughly on that basis. How did you arrive at that assessment? What's the basis for assessing that there'll be around 12,000 people a year seeking support?
Mr Bennett might be able to provide more detail, but essentially we looked at applications for crisis payment, so total numbers of those, noting you can get that multiple times a year, data from the ABS around people who reported that they'd had to leave home due to violence. So we used a couple of data sources, but obviously it's an estimate, and part of the trial will be sort of finding out whether that estimate was right or not.
But Senator McAllister, as you rightly pointed out, it is demand-driven.
So if double the demand emerges, you will meet the demand. Ms Heffron-Webb, is it possible for you to table the analysis that you undertook to make that estimate, appreciating that it is an estimate?
Yeah, we certainly should be able to refer you to the data sources that we utilised. I don't know that there's formal modelling, but we looked at a couple of data sources, so we will furnish you with the detail of that.
Yeah, if I can ask it in this way, if the department is able to, can the department please table documentation that was developed to support the estimate of 12,000 women a year? Can the department please provide information about the data sources that were utilised to develop the estimate? Thank you. I just want to go back to this decision, Minister, to rely reasonably heavily in the program design on vouchers. And the reason I'm asking is that I have had some feedback from service providers that their concern is that it creates a situation where a person may not feel in control of their own circumstances. And you've explained to me, and I appreciate the explanation, that the basis for building vouchers into the system in the way that you have is to mitigate any risks of financial abuse, or to create options to mitigate risks for financial abuse. Can I just confirm that you did receive advice about the risk of financial abuse being present in these circumstances, and from whom?
Well, obviously, financial abuse is one of the new and emerging areas that we have been doing quite a lot of work on, as you'd be aware, obviously, with your involvement with the plan. But we don't have and have not sort of impressed on Uniting Care that we have a preference for vouchers as opposed to cash. What we would be seeking to do would be to use the expertise of Uniting Care to assess the situation and work with the individual in relation to what best fits their circumstance. We have no view about cash, about a preference for vouchers. So I will certainly follow that back up, or Mr Bennett will follow up with Uniting Care around that, because that is not the position of the government in relation to this payment.
Okay.
And as well, not the design element of it. It may just be something that Uniting Care, as a matter of course, because they do deal with domestic and family violence victims regularly, it may be something that they have sought for the reasons that you also pointed out around financial abuse. So I'll follow that up and I'll get back to you offline.
So essentially it's a recommendation from the provider about the structure.
Well, I want to check that because of what you've just said, because it is certainly not my understanding that we have indicated any preference for vouchers.
Okay. Just a final couple of questions, I hope, around the selection of Uniting Care. Did this go to tender?
Yes, it went to a restricted tender.
Right, so it's a restricted tender. I note on the what is routinely called the Harradine file list, there is a document titled EF21, Social Welfare Development Reporting, Routine Operational Transitional Measures Team, Escaping Violence Program, Grant Management, and it talks about grant opportunity guidelines. Is there a grant process associated aside from the tender?
Sorry, it was a grant. It wasn't technically a tender, so it wasn't a procurement.
I
It was
see.
a grant process, but it was a competitive, restricted grant process. So we approached a select number of providers who have a national footprint that are involved with our emergency relief program, and invited them to apply under grant opportunity guidelines. So that's what that
Right.
is referring to.
My team may have just missed this, but were the guidelines published at any point? We couldn't find anything on the Community Grants Hub.
I believe it may have been an ad hoc process because of the time frame and because it's just a trial. So under the grant guidelines, where you're doing a short-term and a trial sort of project, you can do an ad hoc grant. And so I believe that might be why the grant guidelines aren't published.
Okay, can they be tabled?
I'll take that on notice.
Is there any public documentation you can point me to about how the program would work other than the material that's on the provider's website?
And the budget material, I'm not aware of other material.
I would be interested in understanding how the number of service providers that were invited to compete for the grant.
I'm just checking. Mr. Bennett might have that.
So 7 organisations were contacted.
And how many responded? How many submitted an application?
Can we take that on notice?
Yeah.
I'm just not sure whether that goes, whether we're allowed to disclose that, whether the organisations would want us to disclose how many applied. I could be wrong.
Look,
We'll just
Chair,
test.
I can see where this is going in the take things on notice, and to save everybody the time, I will, and keep the Chair happy, can I please ask that the department provide the documentation that was provided to eligible applicants for this grant, the documentation that was provided to confirm the grant with the successful applicant, and in particular, I am interested in understanding the performance standards and the KPIs, whichever terminology you presently use, that have been put around the grant to secure performance.
Yeah, we'll get you as much as we possibly can.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Chair. I appreciate it.
Could I just do one follow-up question?
Yes. Yeah.
Minister, I understood, and I'm sorry I missed this, that Senator McAllister started off with a constituent issue.
So in Western Australia,
Yeah, I just want to understand that or someone is following that up.
Yes, so I asked Senator McAllister, understanding that obviously you
Yeah,
don't want to disclose
sure.
who it is. I don't know whether it's you or whether it's you from Western Australia, but I would be very keen to get to the bottom of this situation, because clearly we don't.
Sure.
I don't want it to happen again.
But does that mean someone from your office will
Well,
follow it up?
Probably on me.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to be very clear on where the status lay, that's all.
Yeah, sure.
In whose court the ball
Yes,
lies.
thank you.
Okay. I will leave it to you. You contact
Okay.
me directly. You've got my
Yeah,
number.
sure, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Chair.
We'll now turn to Senator Waters.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks, everyone. Just sticking with the escaping violence grants, of those 7 that you said were invited to apply for the grant, how many of those were religious organisations?
Senator, I'd probably take that on notice. The 7 that were approached were in the operations within emergency relief, and I would just need to go back and have a look at what would be classified as religious.
Thank you. If you are able to do that while we're in session today, that would be really great.